So some of the posts and topics on teamsportcoaching.com lately have centred around game-based training and some of the things that go along with that. So I thought it'd be worthwhile doing a presentation and looking at the practical implementation of some of the principles related to game-based training, and specifically on something called constraints, or a constraints-led approach in game-based training. So if we work through it, typically you've coached a game or you're in pre-season training or whatever the case might be, and there's a learning objective that you're trying to achieve in some aspect of the game, whether it be a certain type of kick, a pattern of play, a defensive system, whatever it is. You have a learning objective, and then obviously the challenge for you as the coach is then designing a learning activity that best allows you to coach and teach that objective. So we're going to use the example today of a handball situation, and let's say that we want to simulate the situation where we're coming out of stoppages using handball, or we're in the corridor using handball. And the thing about those is there's often a lot of player density around, so a lot of opposition players, and we want to emphasise the use of the flat handball. We don't want over the top loopy handballs, because that gives the defending team time to close us down, tackle us, and potentially we turn the ball over. So that's, let's say we're going to look to design a handball game of some sort that will enforce and give the players a learning opportunity about how to use a flat handball versus a loopy over the top one. We'll carry on. So we want a handball game, and we're going to use a constraints-led approach in designing how this handball game works. So basically constraints are any factors at any given time that influence how performance or learning unfolds. And in the model there's generally three categories of constraints. One could be individual constraints on the individual player, and that can be things like fatigue or perceived pressure. It can also be things like how far they can kick the ball. So for example, a player coming out of half back, if he can only kick the ball 40 metres versus a player who can kick it 60, his options are different, aren't they? For the player than compared to the player who can kick it 60. So his decision making and the action he ends up taking to solve the problem of, say, where to kick to next is different from perhaps other players. So that's an example of individual constraints. There's also environmental. Common ones could be the playing surface. Things like rain and wind, obviously wind's a common one, that impact on how the learning objective can be achieved. And the final one, and most common one, is task constraints, and this is the one that coaches will most often manipulate in terms of in order to achieve the learning objective. So this can be things like rules of the game, the equipment you use, the playing area, the player density, the amount of opposition numbers versus offensive numbers versus defensive numbers, etc., etc. So all these three constraints exist, and the problem for the player is how to come to the solution to achieve that learning objective. So given all the constraints that exist at that moment in time, whether it's a game, a drill, whatever it is how they handle those and come to a solution for whatever your objective is. In our case, we're talking about using flat handball. So handball game example, we'll come back to it. We've said we don't want to use loopy handballs, so let's have a look. This is a handball we want to avoid. As we said, for reasons described, it's easily shut down. The over-the-top one gives time for the defender to come in and wrap the player up. So the task constraint we're going to implement in this handball game is a simple rule that we're not going to use any over-the-top handball. So that'll be a rule that any over-the-top handball is an immediate turnover. Now, what that means is players, given that rule, now have to find a solution to still playing this game without using over-the-top handballs. What then follows is how they're given the opportunity to explore the solution to that problem. And this is where constraints and something called implicit learning come into play. So at the start of the drill, one option for the coach is he said no over the top handballs. At the start of the drill, he could say, okay guys, so what does that mean? How are we going to create flat handballs? So he could ask them, and that would be an explicit approach to learning, is to get the players to think beforehand and then verbalise how they might solve the problem. Another way is simply, as we're doing, is to manipulate the constraints, enforce a rule, and then let the drill unfold and let the players discover the best way to solve the problem in the drill, and that's called implicit learning. And here's a description at the as you see on your screen, from Damien Farrow, who's a skill acquisition expert at the OES, describing how implicit learning works. So if we come back to a handball game, we've now implemented the rule that there's no over-the-top handball. So here's another situation. If we pause it here, where previously this player here on the right might have run forward and the player with the ball might have given an over-the-top handball. Now players have to solve the problem another way of going about it. So it gives a flat one in close, ends up drawing the defender, can give another flat one forward, and they get out. So hopefully what the players have found, perhaps by doing the drill, say for 5 minutes, are some of the principles that might work, but they've learnt these implicitly. And they might be things like drawing the defender, so making the defender have to commit to the ball carrier before giving it off. Might also be the receiver's angle to receive the ball, obviously not getting directly behind the defender, maybe having to hold his run to receive the ball at an angle that the handball can be given flat. So there's some of the things that players might work out for themselves, and once they've done that drill for 5 minutes, there's no problem then in the coach calling a break and saying what sort of things have worked. So while they've learned it implicitly to start, some players will automatically pick up on the things that have worked and be able to verbalise them, so it'll be an explicit learning process from then on. But that's okay, that's the way it works. So that's an example of manipulating constraints in a game to provide an implicit learning opportunity for the players, in this case using the flat handball. One other way constraints can work, obviously, in the drill, is to manipulate them to overload either the offence or defence, so increase the difficulty of the drill. A simple way to do this, or maybe it's a bit unique for a handball game, is to overload the defence. Is to what we've done in the past is, I'll get to it in a second, incorporate a tennis ball. So it's actually not a football, it's a tennis ball that can be thrown around. And what this means is the tennis ball is a lot quicker to dispose of. It travels probably through the air quicker. So the ball actually moves a lot quicker in this game, which is overloading the defensive team. So their reaction, prediction, sharpness to still get at the ball carrier and close down space has to be so much better, because the ball can be thrown around a lot easier and disposed of a lot better as well. So here's a way that we've manipulated another constraint, in this case the equipment, as in the ball, and it's had an effect of overloading the defensive team. I'll say do it okay in that clip. So that's just another way that you can use constraints, is to overload certain situations. So what have we covered? We looked at, obviously, to start with, as a coach, you've got to define what your learning objective is, and then look at the activity to provide players the opportunity to achieve that learning objective. But by manipulating constraints, which could be environmental, player, or most commonly task constraints, you can give players the opportunity to learn implicitly the principles involved in solving the problem. In our case, it was the use of the flat handball, and we can also manipulate constraints to overload the situation, either for the offensive or defensive team, as we choose. So that's just a quick look at using a constraints-led approach in game-based training. As always, we'd love to hear from you. Visit our website or email admin@teamsportcoaching.com.